The initial impressions that German officers had of America's aircraft carriers were not derived from textbooks or intelligence reports, but rather from the expansive ocean itself, where warships traversed the swells like gigantic shadows. During the early months of the Second World War, when the Atlantic remained the primary theater for German naval operations, most officers of the Marine envisioned a navy that heavily depended on battleships, cruisers, and the silent threat of U-boat. Aircraft carriers were viewed as innovative, potentially useful in specific roles, yet hardly central to a fleet. The Royal Navy possessed carriers, but their size and number were limited, leading German officers to regard them as delicate vessels that necessitated substantial protection. This viewpoint began to evolve as first-hand accounts of American naval power began to reach Berlin. Initially, these accounts appeared to be exaggerated. Submarine captains returning from Atlantic patrols reported seeing enormous silhouettes on the horizon, ships larger than anything they had previously conceived. They were not simply carriers in the European context, but rather floating fortresses that seemed to merge the bulk of a battleship with the functionality of an airfield. German naval intelligence intercepted signals and obtained reconnaissance photographs, yet paper and ink could not convey the weight of reality. It was only when German officers had the rare opportunity to observe these vessels firsthand or analyze them post-engagement that the realization began to dawn. One of the earliest points of contact occurred indirectly through the experiences of U-boat commanders, who recounted encounters in which convoys, once deemed vulnerable, suddenly had continuous air support, not from distant land bases, but from mobile platforms at sea. These carriers were not minor auxiliary vessels. They deployed numerous aircraft capable of patrolling the ocean for submarines, compelling U-boat to submerge and conceal themselves. The equilibrium between hunter and hunted began to shift. For German officers trained in doctrines that allowed submarines to attack convoys with relative ease, the understanding that convoys could now operate under a constant aerial defense was profoundly disturbing. As the war's focus shifted toward the Pacific, German officers kept a close watch through intelligence exchanges with their Japanese counterparts. Reports from the Pacific conveyed a blend of admiration and fear. Accounts of the Battle of Midway, for example, highlighted not only the tactical genius of the Americans, but also the remarkable ability of their carriers to project power over vast distances. To German strategists familiar with Atlantic geography, where Britain served as the central island stronghold, the concept of naval air power spanning the entire Pacific was nearly unimaginable. Nevertheless, the Americans had turned this concept into a reality. There were instances when German prisoners of war, including naval officers, were brought aboard American carriers for transport or interrogation. These individuals later recounted their experiences with incredulity. They described hangar decks that resembled vast cathedrals filled with aircraft arranged in orderly rows. They spoke of elevators that raised and lowered planes as if by some industrial sorcery, crews operating with mechanical precision, and expansive galleys serving thousands of sailors in shifts. In contrast to the cramped quarters of a U-boat or even a German battleship, the carrier appeared to be an entire city adrift on the ocean. The sheer magnitude of these vessels was perhaps the most astonishing aspect. German capital ships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz were massive by European standards, yet they were designed for heavy armor and artillery rather than aviation capabilities. An American carrier, on the other hand, was nearly as large but dedicated its size to air wings, fuel supplies, and the upkeep of continuous flight operations. German officers could not overlook that one such vessel was equivalent to multiple airfields moving in formation, capable of launching successive waves of sorties. This vision fundamentally challenged the core principles of their naval doctrine, which had historically focused on decisive gunnery duels and covert submarine operations. Compounding the surprise was the seemingly nonchalant manner in which the Americans deployed these colossal vessels. While the German Navy agonized over each sortie of its limited fleet, American carriers appeared to operate in multiple theaters simultaneously. By the years 1942 and 1943, intelligence reports indicated the rapid launch of new classes of carriers, each one larger and more advanced than its predecessor. For German officers, who had witnessed shipbuilding in Germany hindered by resource shortages and Allied bombings, the American capacity to produce these floating fortresses seemed almost supernatural. However, beyond the mere statistics and dimensions, there was a psychological aspect to the initial encounters. German officers recognized that the presence of a carrier transformed the nature of naval engagements. A fleet accompanied by a carrier possessed the ability to extend its vision far beyond the horizon. It had the capability to strike submarines before they could even prepare for a torpedo attack. It offered the versatility to support landings, disrupt enemy supply lines, and dominate the skies wherever it operated. For officers trained in the traditions of surface warfare, this represented nothing short of a revolution at sea. It is unsurprising that when German officers recounted their first experiences with America's aircraft carriers, their accounts were imbued with disbelief. They had entered a new realm of naval power, one that fused industrial strength, technological advancement, and strategic creativity. The floating cities they observed were not merely ships. They symbolized a declaration of how naval warfare would be conducted and ultimately decided. To the German naval mindset of the early 1940s, a warship was characterized by its artillery and armor. The magnificence of the Bismarck, or the Tirpitz, resided in their enormous cannons, the robustness of their steel plating, and the prestige they embodied as emblems of Reich power. Aircraft carriers, by contrast, appeared delicate, overly dependent on aircraft that could be shot down or rendered ineffective by adverse weather conditions. However, as the Marine began to gather intelligence regarding the American Essex-class carriers and their predecessors, they uncovered information that contradicted their initial beliefs. These vessels were not merely fragile support ships. They were floating metropolises designed to withstand challenges and assert dominance. The metaphor of a floating city was not merely figurative. American carriers resembled industrial facilities constructed upon steel hulls that extended nearly 3 football fields in length. German officers, upon first examining detailed accounts, were taken aback by the magnitude. Flight decks extensive enough to launch heavy bombers, hangars filled with numerous aircraft, fuel reserves capable of sustaining operations for weeks, and workshops equipped to repair damaged planes on site. These attributes provided the carriers with a level of self-sufficiency that Germany had never envisioned. For those accustomed to European naval customs, the concept of a vessel capable of accommodating and deploying an entire wing of aircraft seemed like a blend of science fiction and reality. The design itself was astonishing. In contrast to the fortified strongholds of German battleships, carriers opted to forego heavy gun turrets in favor of expansive runways and aviation facilities. Initially, this decision appeared to many German officers as a reckless risk. Why would one remove a warship's primary armaments? Yet reports quickly indicated that the aircraft themselves served as weapons, more adaptable and far-reaching than any cannon. A single carrier could deploy reconnaissance planes to survey hundreds of miles in all directions, dive bombers to attack enemy vessels, and fighters to protect the fleet from aerial assaults. The ship itself transformed into a mobile aviation fortress, reshaping the definition of naval power. Within these ships, the impression of a city at sea was even more pronounced. American carriers boasted expansive mess halls that catered to thousands of sailors, sleeping quarters that were significantly larger than those found on German warships, and medical facilities that resembled small hospitals. Officers were astonished by the presence of recreational amenities, including gyms, barbershops, and even movie projectors. Such luxuries were unimaginable on a German cruiser or submarine. The rationale was both straightforward and ingenious. A crew that was supported by comfort and routine could withstand prolonged deployments and maintain combat readiness far longer than personnel confined within steel coffins. German officers who caught sight of these floating communities had to concede that morale, logistics, and human resilience had been intricately woven into the very fabric of the design. The operational choreography was equally impressive. Elevators efficiently transported planes between the hangar and flight deck, while crews executed rehearsed routines that resembled an industrial ballet. The process of launching numerous aircraft in rapid succession Recovering them with precise landings and preparing the next wave was refined to a level approaching automation. In German vessels, every significant maneuver was overseen by officers and adhered to a strict hierarchy. Conversely, on American carriers, sailors were empowered through training and systems to make decisive actions, creating a continuous rhythm of activity. German reports described this as both foreign and daunting. Another aspect that elicited disbelief was the carriers' logistical independence. Equipped with their own machine shops, spare parts, and reserves of aviation fuel, these ships could operate autonomously without relying on immediate shore bases. A carrier group could venture into isolated waters and conduct extended operations without the need to wait for supply convoys. This capability was nearly unimaginable to the German Navy, which was tightly bound to European ports and vulnerable supply lines. In contrast, the Americans had developed a war machine that carried its own lifelines, allowing for a level of strategic flexibility that appeared limitless. Perhaps the most astonishing element was the magnitude of their aviation capacity. While British carriers operated with a limited number of aircraft, American supercarriers showcased air groups numbering between 80 and 100 planes. German officers, who were used to considering naval engagements in terms of surface gunnery duels, found it challenging to comprehend this new reality. The disparity was remarkable. An individual American carrier could unleash firepower comparable to that of multiple airfields, capable of maneuvering to any location and targeting enemies that believed they were secure behind vast oceans. It seemed as though the Americans had mastered the art of manipulating geography to their strategic benefit. The concept of floating cities transcended mere size. It represented a comprehensive philosophy of warfare. The Americans prioritized mobility, projection, and sustainability over sheer brute force. They constructed vessels that could transport not only armaments, but also the essential infrastructure for an entire military campaign. In doing so, they pioneered a novel form of warfare in which distance and isolation provided no sanctuary. German officers, upon examining battle reports and photographs, privately acknowledged that the equilibrium of naval power was undergoing an irreversible transformation. The era of the battleship was drawing to a close, giving way to the dominance of the aircraft carrier. In the reflective moments of post-war memoirs, some German naval officers conceded that they had misjudged the significance of the carriers until it was too late. They reminisced about the first time they encountered images of these floating cities, and recognized that Germany lacked a viable response. The Reich had staked everything on U-boats and a limited number of capital ships, while America, across the Atlantic, had assembled a fleet of mobile airfields. The astonishment lay not only in the steel and tonnage, but also in the realization that Germany's naval vision had been too constrained for those who had dedicated their careers to the reverence of artillery and armor. The American carrier emerged as both a revelation and a cautionary tale. It served as evidence that victories in warfare were no longer achieved by adhering to outdated doctrines, but by boldly reimagining the battlefield. For German officers, the war's floating cities were simultaneously fearsome and awe-inspiring, emblematic of a new era for which they had not been adequately prepared to engage. Life on board America's aircraft carriers appeared to German officers, whether they heard about it or later witnessed it, as nothing less than surreal. For individuals accustomed to the oppressive atmosphere of a U-boat or the austere routines of German surface vessels, the American carrier symbolized an entirely different realm, a city adrift on the ocean, complete with its own rhythms, comforts, and hierarchies. It was indeed a warship, but it also functioned as a community designed to sustain thousands of men, not only in survival, but also in effectiveness throughout extended deployments. As German officers gathered more information about these ships, whether through intelligence reports, seized documents, or first-hand experiences as captives, they increasingly recognized that they were facing something deeply foreign to their own customs. One of the initial aspects that left them astonished was the perception of space. On a U-boat, every inch of steel was packed with machinery, bunks, and torpedoes, with the air saturated by diesel fumes, sweat, and tension. Although German battleships offered more generous space, it remained strictly utilitarian, characterized by narrow corridors, small mess halls, and cramped cabins. In stark contrast, American carriers sprawled out like floating towns. The hangar deck alone could accommodate an entire U-boat and still have space to spare. The flight deck extended longer than most streets in Europe. Traversing from bow to stern felt like embarking on a journey for German officers accustomed to confined warfighting machines. This expanse appeared almost extravagant to them. Furthermore, the living conditions were noteworthy. Reports depicted mess halls capable of seating hundreds simultaneously, menus that provided more variety than German sailors could ever imagine, and refrigeration systems that kept provisions fresh for weeks at sea. While German crews relied on hard bread, canned meats, and thin soups, American sailors enjoyed hot meals featuring fresh vegetables, eggs, and even ice cream. Prisoners who had the opportunity to experience these meals firsthand later confessed that the sheer abundance was demoralizing in itself. How could Germany maintain morale and resilience when the enemy's sailors appeared to live in a floating cafeteria instead of a steel cage? The carriers also featured medical facilities that German officers compared to small hospitals. They included surgical bays, wards for the injured, and trained personnel prepared to address not only combat injuries, but also illnesses that could spread among large crews. For German sailors, medical care was frequently basic, with a ship's doctor improvising with limited resources. In contrast, American carriers had an industrialized approach to medicine, designed for scale and integrated into the wartime routine. This was not merely a question of comfort. It demonstrated a logistical capability that Germany could not replicate. A wounded sailor on a carrier might be back on duty within days, while his German counterpart could remain incapacitated or perish due to inadequate care. Even leisure activities were incorporated into the system. German officers were astonished to discover that carriers featured gyms, barber shops, and areas for film screenings for entertainment. These amenities initially seemed trivial to many, until they recognized their role in preserving the sanity of thousands of men during prolonged sea assignments. In stark contrast, boredom and claustrophobia were persistent adversaries on German ships, undermining morale and discipline. The Americans, with their focus on comfort, appeared to grasp that warfare at sea involved not only the endurance of steel, but also the endurance of the spirit. The order and discipline observed on these carriers also left a significant impression on the Germans, albeit in unexpected ways. German warships operated under a strict hierarchy, with every action dictated by the authority of officers. Conversely, reports from American carriers depicted a more adaptable approach. Sailors were extensively trained for specific roles, and given the autonomy to perform them swiftly and with initiative. In particular, the efficiency of flight deck operations amazed German observers. Hundreds of men donned in colored uniforms were engaged in directing planes, fueling them, arming them, and clearing decks within minutes. What may have appeared chaotic was, in reality, a meticulously choreographed ballet of individuals and machinery. German officers who favored strict order conceded that this more relaxed American approach somehow achieved a higher level of precision. The psychological impact of this situation could not be overlooked. For the German officers, the disparity was humiliating. They recognized that their sailors operated under conditions of scarcity, discomfort, and unrelenting pressure. In contrast, American crews fought with the strength of abundance, supported by systems that attended to their needs and enhanced their effectiveness. The carriers represented more than mere war machines. They embodied the American industrial philosophy, which posited that human performance could be optimized through investment in worker welfare. To German minds conditioned to sacrifice and discipline, this concept was both foreign and unsettlingly effective. Additionally, the sheer scale of coordination among various roles on the carrier was remarkable. Pilots, mechanics, deck crews, gunners, cooks, and doctors each played a vital role in the larger mechanism. German officers who examined these ships noted how the entire carrier operated like a small city-state, where every citizen had a designated place and responsibility. The warship was not merely a vessel. It was a society afloat, complete with its own hierarchy, culture, and routines. The sense of permanence and stability it projected was strikingly contrasted with the precarious existence of German naval crews. For many German officers, this realization was devastating. They confronted an adversary that had constructed not only ships, but also systems that sustained warfare in ways the Reich could not emulate. These floating cities showcased America's capacity to integrate technology, logistics, and human welfare into a cohesive instrument of power. While Germany's warships epitomized steel will and defiance, the American carriers represented something grander, a civilization mobilized for total war. In the reflections following the war, German officers admitted that the carriers instilled in them a feeling of futility. How could they possibly expect to triumph over a nation that deployed not only machines of destruction, but also entire societies equipped with comforts and resilience? These floating cities represented more than mere ships. They served as evidence that America could project not only military might, but also a way of life, one that was crafted to withstand the trials of war. While the size and living conditions aboard American carriers left German officers in awe, the real shock came when they understood the industrial strength that had enabled the creation of such vessels. For Germany, each significant warship was the culmination of years of meticulous planning, limited resources, and intense discussions among the Reich's leadership. A vessel like the Bismarck had been a unique accomplishment that demanded substantial financial investment and political influence. In contrast, the Americans regarded carriers not as rare gems but as products rolling off an assembly line. German intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 expressed disbelief at the shipyards along the American coasts that were launching carriers at a pace that seemed beyond imagination. While Germany struggled to repair damage from Allied bombings and keep up with U-boat production, the United States appeared to be laying keels for new Essex-class carriers as if they were merchant vessels. Entire classes of ships were being completed in mere months rather than years. For officers who had endured endless shortages of steel, oil, and skilled labor, these reports appeared exaggerated, almost like propaganda. However, the reality was even more severe. America's industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. The disparity lay in both scale and philosophy. Germany's war industry was fragmented, vying for Hitler's approval, frequently mismanaged, and chronically under-resourced. In contrast, America's industry was centralized, coordinated, and supported by a vast supply of raw materials. Carriers were constructed in parallel rather than in sequence. With numerous shipyards operating concurrently, German officers understood that even if one carrier were lost, another would quickly take its place. The feeling of permanence was overwhelming, while Germany held on to each battleship as if it were irreplaceable. In contrast, America regarded its giants as expendable within a larger production framework. What particularly disturbed German strategists was how these carriers represented the fusion of democracy and industry. Sailors who were well-fed and lived in relative comfort were backed by an economy that had mobilized without faltering. German officers were acutely aware of the fragility of their own system, where shortages and rationing strained both civilian and military morale. Meanwhile, American factories produced ships, planes, and supplies, while civilians continued to enjoy consumer goods and a degree of stability. It was as if the carriers themselves served as tangible evidence that the Reich was contending with a nation whose resources and organizational capabilities were nearly limitless. This industrial advantage implied that no tactical victory could genuinely alter the equilibrium. Even if a U-boat Wolfpack or surface raider succeeded in sinking a carrier, the Americans would merely replace it, likely with a newer, larger, and more sophisticated model. The floating cities of war were not isolated accomplishments, but rather the visible peaks of an industrial iceberg. For German officers, this acknowledgement was a bitter pill to swallow. They were not just battling ships, but the entire machinery of a continent-spanning nation. Ultimately, the shock was not solely about steel and tonnage, but about time. Germany was running short of it, while America appeared capable of producing more of everything with each passing month. Each new carrier launched served as a further reminder that the Reich's naval aspirations were doomed not by tactics, but by arithmetic. For German officers, entrenched in doctrines of surface gunnery and submarine warfare, the realization that America's carriers not only housed vast crews, but also wings of aircraft was profoundly disorienting. They had developed their strategies based on the might of battleships and the stealth of U-boats. However, the introduction of carriers brought forth a new reality. The true power of the ship lay not in its steel or armaments, but in the squadrons of aircraft capable of reaching hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Reports that came back from the Atlantic, and more vividly from the Pacific, depicted fleets that appeared to engage in combat with invisible forces. Convoys that were once secure beyond the protection of land-based air cover now faced constant danger. Dive bombers emerged unexpectedly, torpedo planes struck with accuracy, and fighters patrolled skies that had previously been thought to be empty. German officers recognized that these aircraft could scout, attack, and defend simultaneously, providing the Americans with eyes, claws, and shields far surpassing any conventional fleet. The scale of aviation aboard the carriers was astonishing. While British carriers might deploy a modest number of planes, an American Essex-class vessel could carry nearly 100. When coordinated into wings, these aircraft could target enemy warships, hunt submarines, and even assist in amphibious landings. The result was an expansion of the battlefield to a scale that the Marines had never anticipated. Suddenly, no surface ship was secure, no submarine was safe, and no coastline was out of reach. The tactical implications became evident following the early Allied landings supported by carriers. German officers observed how air wings neutralized coastal defenses before troops even approached the beaches. They witnessed how carriers shielded fleets from the Luftwaffe, projecting American power over contested waters with unyielding pressure. Each aircraft lost could be replaced. Each wave launched without hesitation because the carriers embodied the industrial strength of America within their steel decks. For German naval strategists, this was catastrophic. Their own doctrine of decisive surface battles crumbled when aircraft could destroy a battleship before it came within firing range. Submarines, once the dread of convoys, found themselves hunted from the skies. Even victories appeared to lack substance. Sinking a single carrier felt insignificant when replacements were already en route. In discussions recorded post-war, German officers acknowledged that the carrier represented a genuine revolution in naval warfare. It was more than merely a vessel. It functioned as a floating airfield that manipulated geography and strategy to align with America's objectives. While a battleship could assert dominance over a specific area of ocean, a carrier had the capacity to control an entire region. For the Marine, this was the most painful lesson. The future of maritime warfare had emerged, and Germany was unprepared. Upon examining the Mediterranean theater, German officers discovered additional evidence of the carrier's transformative influence. By 1942, Allied operations in North Africa and subsequently in Sicily demonstrated how these floating cities could alter the course of entire campaigns. German and Italian forces had previously depended on the narrowness of the sea, convinced that shore-based aircraft and Axis naval resources could maintain control over the Mediterranean. However, with the arrival of American and British carriers, the Allies expanded their reach into waters once considered secure. Reports from Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, profoundly disturbed German officers. Carrier-based aircraft offered constant protection for convoys transporting personnel and supplies across the Atlantic. Luftwaffe squadrons stationed in Tunisia and Sardinia found themselves under attack before they could even approach striking range. German accounts indicated that the Allies appeared to transport their own airfields, capable of deploying waves of fighters and bombers wherever necessary. For the first time, the Mediterranean was no longer a chessboard dominated by the Axis in the air. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 further solidified this lesson. Carriers aided the landing forces by bombarding coastal defenses, disrupting reinforcements, and protecting the fleet from counterattacks. German officers who had long regarded amphibious operations as susceptible to failure now observed as carrier-based aviation rendered them not only feasible, but remarkably effective. The carriers established a protective dome that enabled troops to advance with minimal hindrance. Conventional defenses, which were intended for artillery confrontations and coastal batteries, simply crumbled beneath this aerial shield. Documents captured from the German forces on the Mediterranean front indicate a prevailing sense of desperation. Field commanders called for increased Luftwaffe support. However, aircraft operating from European bases were unable to match the operational tempo of carrier squadrons stationed just offshore. Each hour, American carriers were capable of launching new sorties. Daily, they could exert continuous pressure without interruption. German officers acknowledged this as the critical advantage, as carriers effectively compressed time and distance in ways that Axis forces could not counteract. In their post-war reflections, several German naval officers conceded that the Mediterranean illustrated their long-held fears regarding America's carrier program. The carriers functioned not as defensive barriers, but as offensive engines of conquest. They enabled the Allies to land at their discretion, strike at will, and overpower local forces before they had the opportunity to respond. For officers who had once placed their faith in the security provided by fortified coastlines and narrow seas, the Mediterranean campaigns demonstrated that the rules of geography had been fundamentally altered. The carriers transformed the Mediterranean into an allied lake, with their decks acting as mobile strongholds impervious to any static defense. For German officers, the lesson was harsh and irrefutable. Control of the seas was no longer reliant on battleships or coastal artillery, but rather on the supremacy of floating airfields. While the Mediterranean revealed Germany to the direct might of Allied carriers, it was the Pacific theater that instilled a deeper, more profound sense of dread among German officers. Reports streamed in through military attachés in Tokyo and intercepted communications. The Americans were conducting a novel form of warfare against Japan, with the aircraft carrier at its core. For German strategists observing from a distance, it was akin to witnessing the future unfold in real time. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 emerged as a significant case study. German officers read with astonishment that 4 Japanese carriers, once regarded as symbols of invincibility, had been destroyed in a single engagement. The Americans, employing code-breaking, precise coordination, and relentless airstrikes, demonstrated that carriers could destroy one another in battles conducted entirely beyond the range of guns. For officers accustomed to the notion of decisive surface clashes, this represented a remarkable reversal. Naval warfare had transitioned from the era of steel duels to one characterized by wings and flight decks. As the Pacific War continued, German intelligence compiled reports on the island-hopping campaigns. Each new island captured by the Americans was supported by carriers that provided their own airfields, thereby eliminating the necessity for vulnerable construction under enemy fire. Japanese forces were relentlessly bombarded day and night by squadrons seamlessly rotating from carrier decks. German officers analyzing these reports grasped the implications. If such tactics were applied to the Atlantic, no harbor, coastal installation, or convoy would remain secure. Even more disconcerting was the pace of American operations. German reports emphasized how damaged carriers were repaired with remarkable speed, while new ones emerged from shipyards in a continuous flow. Unlike Germany's scarce and irreplaceable battleships, the Americans regarded carriers as renewable assets within a broader war system. This industrial resilience indicated that even significant losses did not impede their progress. To German officers, the lesson was unmistakable. America could withstand blows and retaliate with increased strength, a nightmarish scenario for any strategist. By 1944, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea revealed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, German observers recognized confirmation that American carrier aviation had attained a level of supremacy that no Axis force could rival. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down while the American fleet remained largely unscathed. German officers privately acknowledged that if the Marine ever confronted such power directly, it would face annihilation. In their view, the Pacific War served as a reflection of what could potentially occur in Europe. They harbored fears that one day these floating cities would traverse into the Atlantic in overwhelming numbers, bringing the same devastation to German shores that they had previously inflicted upon Japan. This concern was not merely tactical, It was also psychological. The carriers represented a form of inevitability, serving as evidence that America's influence was global and its power unassailable. As the war neared its conclusion, the image of America's aircraft carriers remained heavily imprinted in the minds of German officers. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, they frequently returned to a singular term when describing them: unfassbar, meaning incomprehensible. The carriers transcended mere ships. They embodied an industrial and strategic philosophy that was so far beyond Germany's capabilities that it instilled a profound sense of futility in many. Captured admirals conceded that their pre-war doctrines had been rendered obsolete almost instantaneously. The battleship, once the pride of the Reich, had been revealed as an anachronism. Submarines, while still lethal, could no longer dominate waters patrolled by carrier aircraft. Even the fortified coastlines in which Hitler had placed immense trust appeared vulnerable when a fleet could project its own airfields directly into the conflict. Officers admitted that their training and imagination had fallen short. They had prepared for the previous war, not the one America was resolutely determined to engage in. Personal accounts illuminated the emotional burden of this realization. Some officers recounted their astonishment at being transported aboard carriers after capture, walking on decks so expansive they resembled boulevards. They described hangars alive with mechanics, planes arranged in endless formations, and the hum of power that seemed limitless. For men raised in a Europe devastated by scarcity, the abundance found aboard these floating cities was profoundly demoralizing. It provided a brief insight into a realm where warfare was maintained not through desperation, but through an overwhelming capacity. Post-war evaluations in Germany also highlighted the symbolic significance of the carriers. They embodied America's exceptional capability to integrate technology, economy, and human welfare into instruments of warfare. Each carrier served as a declaration that the United States could exert force anywhere at any time, with a self-sufficiency that rendered geography irrelevant. For many former German officers, this realization was a bitter pill to swallow, not only because it indicated defeat, but also because it exposed the limitations of the Reich's vision. Germany had staked everything on outdated models of power, while America had transformed the very nature of the battlefield. In the years following the surrender, memoirs released by naval officers frequently conveyed an undertone of admiration. They recognized that no strategy could rival the sheer momentum of American carrier warfare. The floating cities were, in their descriptions, the handwriting on the wall, evidence that Germany's naval aspirations had been doomed from the outset. For these individuals, the carriers evolved into symbols of inevitability. They served as reminders that the outcome of the war had been determined not only on the front lines, but also in the factories, shipyards, and doctrines that had influenced its trajectory long before the first shots were fired. To the German officers who had once placed their faith in the supremacy of steel and willpower, the carriers emerged as monuments to a new era, an era where the sea was not dominated by the most powerful gun, but by the largest deck.